I do have a question, Tanya. How are you?
I'm good, Anne. How are you?
I'm good. It was good to see you at the CAB conference finally. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
So I wanted to go back to what Erica had mentioned earlier because this week I had a buyer approach me and a buyer that I've been working with on a transaction um and asked me to look for some property for
Mhm.
him. And then we're going back to the same transaction that we had helped him with earlier. Um, so I've never represented a buyer before. Is there a buyer representation exclusivity form? Because we've only represented sellers
Yeah.
um, due to legal stuff, but there is one
hmm
that
It's in, are you
for
EXP?
business transactions or for
Oh, you said you're with CAB. So yeah, there is a buyer rep agreement if you go into Legito.
mm,
Yeah,
okay,
there is a buyer representation agreement.
for
And
business
when you,
transactions?
yeah, it's an exclusive. And when you do that, when you fill that out, it'll also create your agency disclosure for you at the same time.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I thought there was one for car, but not for cab. But there is one for cab. That's perfect.
Yes. Yeah, CAB.
And then
I don't think car has one, but it might. I don't know.
hmm,
Car only has like 3 business forms. That's it, or what I've been told, and they have 0 training. So
okay.
really, they need to stay in their lane and get out of the business sales and refer that to cab because
Okay, I'll look at
that's
cab.
all cab
No, that's
does.
good to know. Um, so my question relates to if I do represent this buyer
Mhm.
for the property transaction, the my business ops is on that property without a lease. Okay. So I represent the seller of that business, which is operating on that property. But my buyer wants to buy like he knows about the business because we've been working on this transaction and he knows that there's no lease. And now he wants me to help him buy property and he's looking at this property. So how do I avoid
So he
what
wants.
would
So he
seemingly
wants. Wait. Let me back that up. So if I'm reading between the lines correctly, and I might not be, but it
Mhm.
sounds to me like the buyer wants to buy the real estate so he can screw the seller of the business.
Yeah, it sounds like that to me too. So I wanted to avoid any like,
Yeah, you have a definite conflict of interest there.
oh, I do.
Yeah, you have
Okay.
a fiduciary duty to your seller.
Mm,
And so if you take on this buyer to buy the real estate, and that is basically the purpose, is to be able to get rid of the seller, kick the seller off, do something that other than buy the seller's business, then yeah, there's a conflict of interest and you'll probably end up in court.
so I should not represent him. My contract with the seller has expired because of the landlord issue. You know what I mean? Like the landlord would not disclose whether he would give a new lease out or whatever. So it's been a year and that contract is expired now. The buyer's so it still is bad optics, right? To
Okay, so in that case, if your contract with the seller has expired, then the best bet is go get the seller's permission.
oh, I see.
If you get written consent from the seller just saying, hey, this buyer
Mm,
wants to hire me to help him or to represent him in attempting to buy the real estate. And so if the seller is willing to sign off on that and say yes, then you're protected. Then the seller can't come back and say there was any type of conflict or anything else. So that would be my recommendation, is just go have a chat. Well, first have a chat with the buyer to see,
right.
what his intentions are. But because you might be able to work some type of a deal with both of them, that would be reasonable, where the seller's not going to get, if the buyer's intention is to buy the real estate and then give the seller a 30-day notice and take his business, there still may be some issues unless you have communicated with the seller that that's a possibility, and then the seller has basically said, signed off on it. So, or
So
signed off on you
disclose, so
representing the buyer.
right. So disclose to the seller that there are possible intentions out there to buy the property out from under him,
Mhm.
right? Or should I get my seller to renew his listing so that the listing is protected, so that when I can't do both, right?
It would be very difficult to do both because then you have a fiduciary duty to both.
The seller, yeah.
Yeah, to both the seller and the buyer. So that presents, I mean, again, the whole thing is just it potentially a big conflict of interest. But if you have a
Right.
conflict waiver, that, and that's what it is, you would get something in writing, and a conflict waiver where the seller's saying, yeah, I you've disclosed that this particular buyer wants to hire you to potentially purchase the real estate, and seller is aware that there may be some potential conflict of interest there and is willing to waive that and allow you to go ahead and represent that buyer. So yeah, but you definitely need some type of a waiver to protect yourself.
Okay.
Now, in terms of the real estate, I mean, did the landlord indicate a willingness to sell the real estate?
I know the landlord is extremely vague. That's why the landlord wants to sell. He's interested in this, in the fact that I have a buyer, but he
Mhm.
won't tell me how long the lease would be to the new owner. Nor, I mean, he's just extremely vague, and it's been like this. So if I don't hone in on this specific property, there are other property opportunities maybe this buyer might be open to.
Yeah,
It's not, so that's why the buyer representation agreement. In fact, he asked me, can you just send me, the documents?
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, if the buyer is looking to buy real estate, then the only conflict you have really is on that one piece of real
Right.
estate where the seller is. Anything else the buyer wants to buy, you're fine. So I would just again get a conflict waiver as to that one piece of real estate. The other thing too is you might want to ask, I mean, has the seller ever, if the real estate, if the landlord wants to sell, has the seller considered buying it?
Yeah, no, that's a good option, right? Because he already is on the property,
Yeah,
and he doesn't occupy more than 50% of the property, however. There are other slots to that
right.
property which aren't rented out right now.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, that is a good option to present that to the business operations guy.
Yeah. I
Seller.
mean, if he's interested, because you said he's not on 50%.
No, he doesn't. He occupies about 35% of the total property
Mm-hmm.
size, and then yeah, there are other slots that are open. I mean,
Okay.
you could get more
Yeah.
slots if the landlord again is the variable, because he's not only vague, he's evasive. So he doesn't
Right.
know what he wants to do. And so that's why the deal with this original buyer fell apart, because we couldn't get the landlord to commit to a big fat lease,
Right.
or, are you going to sell this property? Although the landlord has called me and said, so what's going on with your buyer? And I said, well, the buyer walked because we've been dragging our feet on a lease.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so
I mean, if you can get the landlord to commit to selling it,
yeah,
then
I'd like to.
yeah. I mean, and then with the seller, if the seller wants to buy it, the seller has an opportunity because he can take 50, since he's already there operating on the business, if he expands or indicates an intention or a business plan to expand so that he's on 50% or more.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so increase his 35% to 50%. Now he can get an SBA loan for the real estate with 10% down.
Mm. So, but ultimately, I mean, the seller wants to retire. So I'm making him now I'm persuading him now to buy property so that he can protect himself.
Well, if he, yeah, I mean, the other way is, like you said, if the buyer buys it and he has no lease, I mean, what's the value of the business? Does a business have very much value?
We had listed it at 650, but taking into market rent for a new buyer, it might be 500, 525.
Okay. So
So,
yeah, so $500,000. I mean, the seller has an opportunity if he sells a business to get $500,000, but if a buyer or somebody buys the real estate and gives him a 30-day notice, then his business has no value at that point, and he's going to lose $500,000 potentially. So that's the issue is, how does he protect himself? And he may protect himself if he can't get a long-term lease or can't get a lease from the landlord, but he has the possibility of buying the business or buying the real estate rather,
mm,
then that will protect him because now nobody else can come in. He can sell the business and the real estate as a package
true. Yeah.
to sell. So if the buyer's interested in both of them, he can sell the whole thing to the buyer, and then he doesn't
Mm,
have to worry about being undermined or losing $500,000. It'll cost him a little bit because obviously, if he buys the real estate, he's going to have some costs that he incurs there, and
mm,
then it might take a few months, find a buyer, whatever. So he's going to have to be making payments on the mortgage, but ultimately it's a decision he would need to make, and that's assuming the landlord is willing to sell the real estate at all. But from a seller standpoint, it's like, okay, you've got potentially $500,000 that needs to be protected. How do you protect it?
mm.
So, I just kind of,
Brainstorm with him a little bit about that
yeah,
strategy.
yeah,
Okay.
just have a conversation, and he look, some sellers don't even care. I mean, some of them have enough assets outside of the business that they literally can just close the doors and walk away, and that would be okay with them too. So he may say,
Mhm.
you know what, if the buyer comes in and buys the real estate, gives me a 30-day notice, yeah, so what? I'm done.
Mm, mm,
I'm okay with that.
mhm.
But every seller has different circumstances, so you really have to sit down and just kind of have a conversation and try and dig a little deep with them.
Yeah,
Um,
so once I present that strategy to him, and if he turns down that strategy of buying the property in order to protect his business, then I'm sort of cleared, right? Because from this conflict of interest, would I be?
well, I would still want something in writing. I mean, I would
Okay.
still want, you can put something together just in a Word doc and just at the top put conflict waiver. Okay.
Okay.
And then in the body of you just want to say you know, that the seller's aware that a potential buyer that he had been negotiating with for the business is interested potentially in buying the real estate and wants you to represent him in the purchase of the real estate. So I would just have, I would have a document like that with me and
Mhm.
have a conversation with the seller. And if the seller says no, he understands that that's a possibility, but he really is not interested in buying the real estate at all, then you just say, okay, well, what are your thoughts on whether or not, I mean, would you be okay if I represent the buyer? The buyer has asked me,
Mm,
I don't want to do it without your authorization, because there is a potential conflict there. And,
mm,
just to have everything above board, I want to ask your permission for it. If he says yeah, then you just give him the conflict waiver and have him sign it, and you put that in your file, and now
okay.
you're protected.
Okay.
But he may also say no, I understand what you're saying, but I really don't want you to represent that buyer, at least not as to this property. Now,
Right.
you can still do a buyer rep agreement with the
Right.
buyer, but then at that point you would just exclude that one piece of real estate
Okay.
and say that, look, this one is off limits because I have a conflict of interest here, but I'll help you buy anything else you want.
Mm,
Right. So, but I think you need to start with the seller.
got it. Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was murky to me, like
Clear as mud, right?
but thank you. That makes it clear.
Yeah. No, it's a tricky situation. It really is. So at the end of the day, you have to look at it from the standpoint of, uh, what can I do to make sure I don't end up in court?
Right.
And if I do end up in court, then what do I have in terms of a document trail or whatever, so that it shows that I did my best to be reasonable about the situation and work with, the seller and so forth. So I think you should be good there.
Okay. Appreciate it.
Mhm.